Have you ever wondered what happens inside the mind of someone who genuinely believes they were chosen by destiny to change the course of history? What kind of thought, what kind of conviction so profound and so absolute can lead a human being to convince himself that his decisions, his dreams, his obsessions, and his most visceral hatreds are, in reality, the will of the universe itself manifesting through him? This is not an abstract philosophical question. It is a question that has a name, a date of birth, and a number of victims that surpasses all human comprehension. The question has an answer, and that answer is called Adolf Hitler. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening to us from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. Good. Now then, let us delve into one of the darkest, most disturbing, and most studied enigmas of all modern history, the mental architecture of Adolf Hitler. Why did he believe he could control the destiny of the world? Where did that almost supernatural certainty come from that he, and only he, was the instrument through which history would fulfill its purpose? Was it madness? Was it genius? Was it fanaticism? Was it trauma? Was it ideology? Or was it a combination of all of that mixed in proportions that humanity had never seen before and would never see again? What you are about to hear is not simply the biography of a dictator. It is the dissection of a mind. It is the analysis of the psychological, ideological, and circumstantial mechanisms that turned a boy born in a small Austrian town into the architect of the greatest catastrophe that Western civilization has known in all its recorded history. And the most unsettling thing of all, what you will find impossible to ignore as we advance in this tale, is that this process was not magical. It was not supernatural. It was not inevitable. It was human. It was the result of decisions, of influences, of failures, of readings, of resentments, and of an extraordinary capacity to build a narrative about himself that others, millions of others, chose to believe. So sit back, prepare yourself, because what is coming is uncomfortable, it is fascinating, it is terrifying, and above all, it is necessary to understand it. Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small border town between Austria and Bavaria. He was the fourth child of Adolf Hitler, a customs official with an authoritarian character and an explosive temperament, and Clara Polzel, a young, devout, and deeply loving woman who adored her son with an intensity that historians have repeatedly described as disproportionate, even by the standards of the time. This apparently minor detail, this contrast between the cold and dominant father and the warm and adoring mother, is not an irrelevant biographical fact. It is, according to many psychologists and historians, one of the first bricks in the construction of Adolf Hitler's psychology. But what does the family dynamic of a 19th century Austrian boy have to do with the conviction that this boy, once converted into an adult, could control the destiny of the world? Much, much more than you imagine. And to understand it, we need to go slowly, layer by layer, as if we were peeling an onion whose deepest essence turns out to be, surprisingly, one of the most dangerous that history has produced. Alois Hitler was not named Hitler when he was born. He bore the surname of his mother, Schicklgruber, and it was not until he was 39 years old that he legalized the surname of his stepfather, Johann Georg Hitler, which with the passage of time and transcription errors in ecclesiastical documents became Hitler. This fact has a certain dark irony. The surname that would become synonymous with absolute evil in the collective imagination of the 20th century was, in its origins, an acquired surname, a constructed identity, not inherited directly. There are those who see in this fact an involuntary metaphor for what Adolf himself would do with his identity throughout his life: construct it, mold it, invent it according to the needs of the moment. Alois Hitler was, by all available accounts, a difficult father, demanding, rigorous, frequently violent in his disciplinary methods. His relationship with Adolf was tense from the moment the boy was old enough to represent something more than a harmless presence in the home. Historians have documented that Adolf was beaten regularly by his father, a pattern of domestic violence that in that era was sadly common, but which left indelible psychological marks on those who suffered it. The father wanted his son to follow in his footsteps in the civil service, to study, to obtain a stable and respectable job within the bureaucratic apparatus of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Adolf, on the contrary, dreamed of being an artist. This tension between paternal will and his own dreams is, superficially, the story of millions of adolescents in any era and place. But in Hitler's case, this tension acquired dimensions that moulded his character in specific and profound ways. First, the resistance to the father was not just adolescent rebellion. It was an affirmation of identity against a figure that represented external authority, imposition, the denial of the individual self. Second, Hitler's artistic dream was neither modest nor provisional. It was, according to his own later declarations, an inner certainty about his destiny, a conviction that he was called to something great, to something that would transcend the mediocrity of the bureaucratic world that his father embodied. And exactly how good was Hitler as an artist? This is a question that deserves an honest answer, because its answer illuminates something fundamental about the psychology we are analysing. Hitler painted with a certain technical dexterity, especially architecture and landscapes. His watercolours of Viennese buildings, which he sold during his years of greatest economic precariousness, show a reasonable capacity for architectural detail. However, art critics who have evaluated his work retroactively agree on one crucial point. His paintings lack life, lack soul, lack that intangible spark that distinguishes the genuine artist from the skilled artisan. There were no human figures in his paintings, or when there were, they were rigid, clumsy, disproportionate. The buildings were alive, the people were not. This absence of humanity in Hitler's art is, for many psychologists, an unsettling window into his inner world. He was capable of seeing and accurately reproducing the structures, the forms, the contours of inanimate objects, but the human dimension, the emotional complexity of people seemed to escape him. This inability, or perhaps disinterest, to capture humanity in his paintings would find a radically different, but equally revealing manifestation decades later, when Hitler would demonstrate an extraordinary facility for seeing people not as individuals but as masses, categories, racial abstractions. But let us return to his childhood. Clara Hitler, his mother, was diagnosed with breast cancer in the year 1907. The disease advanced with cruelty, and Adolf, who had already abandoned school and was living in Linz without any concrete plan for his future, became her primary caregiver. The doctor who attended Clara during her last months was Dr. Eduard Bloch, a Jewish doctor who treated the dying woman with all the dedication and care that his profession demanded. Clara Hitler died on the 21st of December 1907, and Adolf was devastated. Bloch would later recall that never, in his long medical career, had he seen a young man so shattered by the pain of losing his mother. Why is this detail important? Because Dr. Bloch was Jewish, and Adolf Hitler, the same man who in a few short years would become the architect of the extermination of the Jewish people, at that moment looked upon that Jewish doctor not with hatred but with gratitude. He even sent him a postcard of gratitude. When the Nazis took power in Austria in 1938, Dr. Bloch was one of the very few Austrian Jews who received special protection by direct order of Hitler. He was allowed to emigrate with his belongings and without the brutal harassment that all other Jews suffered. Hitler called him at one point a noble Jew, one of the extremely rare exceptions that his ideology, in its twisted internal logic, permitted when personal debt required it. This anecdote is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a window into something fundamental in Hitler's psychology, his capacity to compartmentalize, to separate abstract ideology from concrete personal experience, to hate a people as a category while protecting individuals, of that people when he had a personal reason to do so. This capacity for compartmentalization, this ability to hold contradictory beliefs, without the contradiction producing any apparent cognitive crisis, would be one of the most defining traits of his mental functioning. But we are still young. We are still that adolescent who has just lost his mother and who does not know exactly what to do with his life. And here we arrive at one of the most crucial moments in the formation of Hitler's identity, his move to Vienna and the years he spent there, between 1907 and 1913. These years are absolutely fundamental to understanding everything that would come later, because in Vienna something occurred that Hitler would never entirely overcome. He failed. Vienna was at that time one of the most vibrant, cosmopolitan, and culturally rich cities in Europe. It was the capital of an empire that was slowly crumbling, but still projected an image of imperial grandiosity. It was also a profoundly contradictory city, brilliant and decadent, innovative and reactionary, multicultural and fiercely nationalistic all at the same time. It was the city of Sigmund Freud and Gustav Klimt, of Johannes Brahms and Karl Kraus. And it was also, sadly, a city with a long tradition of organized and virulent anti-Semitism. Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna with the intention of studying at the Academy of Fine Arts. It was his dream, the validation that his talent deserved according to his own evaluation of himself. He submitted his application, took the admission exams, and was rejected, not once but twice. In 1907 and in 1908, the director of the Academy who evaluated his work explained to him, with a frankness that must have been devastating, that his skills were not those of a painter but of an architect, and that if he wanted to study at the institution, he should do so in the School of Architecture. But the School of Architecture required a secondary education diploma that Hitler did not possess because he had abandoned his studies before completing them. The failure at the Academy was for Hitler a wound that never completely healed, not simply because his dream was rejected, but because the manner in which he interpreted that rejection was profoundly revealing of his psychology. A young man with a healthy emotional structure could have concluded, "My skills lie in another area. I am going to explore other possibilities. I am going to complete my studies. I am going to attempt architecture." Hitler did not arrive at any of those conclusions. Instead, he developed the conviction that the system had failed, that the institutions were corrupt or manipulated, that his genius could not be recognized by those who lacked the vision to see it. This inability to integrate failure in a constructive manner, this tendency to externalize responsibility for failure onto external factors, instead of examining his own limitations, is a psychological pattern that historians and psychologists have repeatedly identified in Hitler. It was not just an occasional defense mechanism. It was the dominant way in which he processed negative experiences. And this way of processing failure would have consequences of incalculable scope when the failure in question came to hold the power of a state in his hands. During the Viennese years, Hitler lived in a poverty that oscillated between precariousness and misery. He sold his watercolours through a friend who placed them in small businesses and establishments. He slept in public dormitories for people without resources. He ate in charity soup kitchens. He spent his days in public libraries, reading voraciously but in an unsystematic manner, accumulating information without the critical filter or the academic structure that would have allowed him to evaluate it rigorously. And in those libraries, in those Viennese streets, in those conversations with other resentful and marginalized young men, Hitler began to absorb the ideas that would become the pillars of his ideology. Racialist anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews were not simply followers of a different religion, but a biologically distinct and biologically inferior, yet paradoxically dangerous race. Pan-Germanism, the belief that all German-speaking people should unify into a single powerful state. Social Darwinism, the distorted application of Darwin's evolutionary theories to relations between human groups, thus justifying the domination of the strong over the weak as an inevitable natural law. None of these ideas were original to Hitler. All of them circulated widely in the Vienna of the early 20th century. The mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, had been making electoral politics with anti-Semitism as a banner for years, and with an electoral success that Hitler admired and studied. Pan-Germanist and racist publications filled the newsstands. The Austrian philosopher Georg Ritter von Schönerer had built an entire political career upon the combination of extreme German nationalism and visceral anti-Semitism. The ideas were in the air, available to anyone who wanted to pick them up. What Hitler did was something different. He took them, made them completely his own, fused them with his wounded narcissism and his accumulated resentment, and turned them into a total worldview, into a closed and self-reinforcing system that explained everything, that justified everything, and that assigned to himself, to Adolf Hitler, a central role in the history of the world. What exactly does it mean that Hitler made these ideas his own? It means that he did not adopt them passively, like someone who accepts an intellectual argument after weighing it. He incorporated them emotionally, viscerally, existentially. He fused them with his own personal narrative, the failure in the academy, the poverty, the marginalization, the resentment against the cultural elites who did not recognize him. Everything found an explanation in the anti-Semitic ideology. If he had not managed to enter the Academy of Fine Arts, it was because the cultural system was dominated by Jews, who protected their own and excluded German artists. If Viennese society was decadent and corrupt, it was because the Jews had corrupted it. If the Austro-Hungarian Empire was weak and in decline, it was because the Jews were destroying it from within. This is the most important psychological function of anti-Semitism in Hitler's mental structure. It was not simply a prejudice, it was a total explanation of the world, a system of interpretation that converted all failures, all frustrations, all the contradictions of existence into products of an identifiable conspiracy, attributable to a concrete enemy. And having a concrete enemy has a powerful psychological effect. It transforms diffuse anguish into focused rage. It transforms impotence into indignation. It transforms the passive victim of circumstances into the active warrior against an identified threat. But before Hitler could turn into that active warrior, he needed something more than ideology. He needed an experience that would give him a new identity, that would transform the failed artist and social outcast into something different. That experience would arrive in August of 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War. Hitler's reaction to the start of the war was one of an euphoria that he himself described as the most intense experience of his life up to that moment. Photographs from the era show the multitude gathered in the Odeonsplatz in Munich on the day the war was declared, and in that multitude, with a face illuminated by what can only be described as ecstasy, appears a young Adolf Hitler. For him, the war was not a national tragedy, it was a liberation, an opportunity, the moment in which history summoned individuals to demonstrate their value and their purpose. Hitler immediately enlisted in the Imperial German Army, not the Austro-Hungarian one, although technically he was an Austrian citizen. This choice is not trivial. Even then his national identity was German, not Austrian. It was the German people that mattered to him. It was Germany, the project that summoned him. He joined the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, informally known as the List Regiment, and was deployed on the Western Front. Hitler's experience in the war was, by all available accounts, genuinely courageous. He was not a rearguard soldier, he was in the trenches, under fire, in the midst of the most brutal violence that 20th century industrial technology had been able to deploy up to that moment. He was wounded on 2 occasions, one of them seriously. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in December of 1914, and what was more extraordinary, the Iron Cross First Class in August of 1918, an extremely rare decoration for a corporal, which was the highest rank Hitler achieved during the entire war. Why did he never ascend higher than corporal? There are different interpretations of this fact. The official explanation from his superiors was that he did not demonstrate leadership qualities, that he was good at following orders and executing missions, but lacked the capacity to command others. Historians have pointed out another possibility, that Hitler himself did not want to be promoted, because that would have meant moving away from the combat front, from the direct experience of the war that he lived with an almost mystical intensity. And therein lies the key. For Hitler, the war was not simply a political or military conflict. It was a spiritual experience, a purification, a test of courage that separated genuine men from mediocre ones. The trenches, with all their horror and their death and their inhumanity, gave him something that civilian life had never given him: a clear purpose, a sharp identity, a community of belonging. He was Corporal Hitler, the regiment soldier, the messenger who ran under fire. He was someone. He was part of something larger than himself. This identity transformation that Hitler experienced during the war is fundamental to understanding what would come later. Before the war, he was a nobody, a failed artist, an educated vagabond, a resentful outcast without direction or purpose. The war turned him into someone. It gave him structure. It gave him demonstrable value. It gave him the experience of belonging to a collective cause. And when the war ended with the German defeat in November 1918, the loss was for Hitler infinitely more than military. It was the loss of the only identity that had made him feel complete. On the 11th of November 1918, while recovering from a mustard gas attack in a hospital in Pasewalk, Hitler received the news of the armistice. His reaction, according to his own account in Mein Kampf, was one of inconsolable weeping, the same weeping he had experienced when his mother died. The parallelism is not accidental. For Hitler, the defeat of Germany was the equivalent of the death of Clara. It was the loss of the motherland, of the adored figure whose destruction left him without protection, without identity, without purpose. But along with the weeping came something else. According to his own account, it was in that hospital, in that moment of absolute despair, when he made the decision that would change the course of history, to dedicate his life to politics, to the struggle for the restoration of Germany, to avenge the betrayal that had led to defeat. Because Hitler, like the vast majority of nationalist Germans, could not accept that Germany had been defeated militarily. The German army had fought brilliantly. That was undeniable. Why then the defeat? The answer that Hitler, and with him millions of Germans, adopted was the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, the idea that Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield but betrayed from within, sabotaged by internal forces that had weakened the home front while the soldiers kept fighting. And who were those traitorous internal forces? In the narrative of Hitler and of the German right in general, the answer was clear: the socialists, the pacifists, and above all, the Jews. This narrative was historically false. Germany was defeated militarily by a combination of factors that included the exhaustion of its resources, the numerical superiority of the Allies after the entry of the United States into the war, and the strategic inability of the German command to adapt its tactics to the changing realities of the conflict. But the historical falsehood of the narrative did not reduce its psychological and political power in the slightest. A nation that has just lost a catastrophic war needs explanations, and the simplest explanations, those that identify concrete culprits, are always the most attractive in moments of collective collapse. Here we arrive at a point that is essential to understand. The stab-in-the-back legend was not simply a convenient lie that Hitler used cynically to manipulate the masses. Hitler believed it with absolute sincerity. For him, it was the truth. And this sincere belief in a historically false narrative is one of the most ominous elements of his psychology, because it establishes a pattern that would be repeated throughout his entire political career. The ability to construct a subjective reality so solid, so emotionally convincing, that it resisted any confrontation with objective facts. Psychologists call this phenomenon by different names: magical thinking, wishful thinking, motivated belief. The principle is always the same. When reality contradicts the narrative we need to maintain our identity and our internal coherence, it is reality that adjusts, not the narrative. Hitler was a master of this adjustment process. not in a cynical way, but in a genuinely psychological way. His mind actively constructed a reality that confirmed his prior beliefs and discarded or reinterpreted everything that contradicted them. After the war, Hitler returned to Munich, which at that time was the epicenter of a Germany in convulsion. The Weimar Republic had been born amid the chaos, defeat, and humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919. The conditions of that treaty were perceived by almost all Germans as a brutal injustice. Germany lost territories on all its flanks. It was imposed to pay war reparations of astronomical magnitude. It was forbidden to have a relevant army, and what perhaps caused the most pain, it was forced to accept Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which attributed to Germany the exclusive responsibility for the conflict. For Hitler, the Treaty of Versailles was the materialization of the betrayal. It was the proof that the forces that had stabbed the German army in the back had managed to impose their agenda. It was the instrument through which the victorious powers, with the complicity of the internal traitors, intended to humiliate Germany forever. And the reversal of the Treaty of Versailles became one of the most constant and consistent pillars of the Hitlerian political program. From his first speeches in the beer halls of Munich to his last military directives in the Berlin bunker. But how does a demobilized corporal, without money, without formal education, without connections, without a career, go from being nobody in particular to becoming the leader of a political movement that will eventually take power in one of the most powerful nations in the world? This transformation is perhaps the most astonishing of Hitler's entire history. And to understand it, we need to comprehend a specific skill that Hitler possessed to a degree that is difficult to overestimate: his capacity as an orator. In September 1919, the German army, concerned about the proliferation of extremist political groups in Munich, sent Hitler to spy on a small organization called the German Workers' Party, founded by a locksmith named Anton Drexler. What was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission turned into something completely different. Hitler attended a party meeting, listened to the speeches of the other speakers, and when one of them made a proposal that seemed absurd to him, he raised his hand and asked to speak. What happened next surprised everyone present, including Drexler himself. Hitler spoke for 20 minutes with an eloquence, a passion, and an argumentative forcefulness that no one in the room had ever heard before. When he finished, Drexler turned to the man sitting next to him and whispered something into his ear that has been recorded in the historical archives. "Goodness, he's got a good mouth on him. We could use him." Hitler received an invitation that same day to join the party, which then had fewer than 60 members and zero political influence. Why was Hitler such an extraordinary orator? This is a question that deserves a serious answer, because Hitler's oratorical capacity was not just a technical skill. It was the expression of something profound in his psychology and the principal tool through which he transformed his vision of the world into real political power. First, Hitler had an instinctive ability to detect and amplify the emotions of his audience. He did not prepare his speeches with structured logical arguments. He prepared them emotionally. He arrived at the venue, observed the public, felt the atmosphere, and then built his speech upon the emotions he perceived in the room. This emotional sensitivity was almost shamanic. Hitler could collectively feel what the audience felt, and then reflect those emotions back to them, magnified, validated, articulated. Second, Hitler did not speak about politics in the conventional sense. He told stories. He built narratives. He described images. His speeches had a dramatic structure, with an exposition of the problem, a climax of indignation, and a resolution that always involved collective action under his leadership. The listener did not leave a Hitler speech with a political program in his head. He left with images, with emotions, with a sense of belonging to something greater, with the feeling that finally someone had said out loud what he felt, but could not articulate. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, Hitler believed absolutely in what he said. He was not a politician who calculated the effect of his words on the audience while privately thinking something different. He was a fanatic who shared with his audience the emotional intensity of his own conviction, and audiences perceived it. The authenticity of fanaticism, as disturbing as this statement may be, has a communicative power that calculated cynicism can never equal. The testimonies of people who heard Hitler speak in those early years of the 1920s are remarkably consistent on this point. People who did not share his ideas, people who were skeptical, people who had come to mock or heckle the speaker, left the rallies profoundly impressed, even moved, although without being able to explain exactly why. It was not that the arguments were irrefutable, they were not. It was that the experience of being in the same space as Hitler while he spoke was extraordinary, in an almost physical sense. With this extraordinary capacity, Hitler began to transform the German Workers' Party from within. He proposed changing the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which in German was abbreviated as NSDAP, and in popular language would soon be known simply as the Nazi Party. He designed the party's program, which included the 25 points adopted in February 1920. He oversaw the creation of the party's symbology, the swastika, an ancient symbol that the pan-Germanist movement already used as an emblem of the Aryan race. He organized the rallies, increasingly larger, increasingly more theatrical, increasingly more effective. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics and will also help the video's engagement, okay? Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues to recommend our videos. In 1 year, the party went from 60 members to several thousands. In 2 years, it was the most dynamic and fastest growing movement in the Bavarian political landscape. How did he do it? With speeches, with propaganda, and with something else, the creation of an atmosphere of organized violence through the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the assault detachments of the party, which intimidated opponents, disrupted the rallies of other parties, and created an image of strength and determination that attracted young war veterans looking to continue the camaraderie and action of the front in peacetime. But what exactly was Hitler thinking during these years? What was the nature of his vision, of his project, of his conviction that he was called to something transcendental? To answer this question, we need to delve into the most important text for understanding his psychology, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, the book that Hitler dictated during his imprisonment in the Landsberg fortress between 1924 and 1925. Mein Kampf is an extraordinarily revealing text, although not in the way Hitler intended it to be. Written with the intention of being a political manifesto and an intellectual autobiography, it turned out to be something much more personal and involuntarily honest, a map of the psychology of its author. Repetitive, disorganized, full of internal contradictions and logical leaps that defy coherence, the book is exactly what Hitler claimed to despise: a mediocre work, which no major publisher would have published under normal circumstances, but which, sold under the pressure of the cult of personality that Hitler had cultivated, became one of the best-selling books in the world during the years he was in power. What does Mein Kampf say about Hitler's psychology? Many things, but allow me to point out the most important ones. First, the book reveals a radically Manichaean worldview, divided in absolute terms between good and evil, between Aryans and Jews, between strength and weakness, between the nation and its enemies. There are no grey areas in Hitler's universe. There is no complexity. There is no ambiguity. There is no recognition that reality could be more nuanced than his simplifying schema permits. Everything fits into his dual system, and anything that does not fit is simply ignored or reinterpreted until it fits. Second, the book reveals a vision of history as a biological racial struggle, in which superior and inferior races compete for the survival and resources of the planet, and in which defeat equals extinction. This vision is not just a political opinion, it is a complete cosmology, a framework of interpretation of reality so total that it excludes any alternative. In Hitler's mental universe, relations between peoples, between nations, between cultures, are inevitably reduced to a single question: who dominates whom? Third, and perhaps most important for our original question about why Hitler believed he could control the destiny of the world, the book reveals a vision of himself as a providential figure, chosen by higher forces to fulfill a historical mission. Hitler does not speak of himself with the modesty of a conventional politician who recognizes the contingency of his position. He speaks of himself as someone who was prepared by the experience of life for the mission he must fulfill, as someone whose personal biography is, in reality, the preparation of a historical instrument. This messianic self-perception, this sense of providential mission, was not a posthumous construction, elaborated once Hitler was already in power. It was something he articulated from the early years of his political career, from the rallies in the beer halls of Munich, from the conversations with his first followers. And what makes this self-perception psychologically fascinating is not only the degree of its intensity, but the way in which it was constructed and reinforced through a series of experiences that Hitler interpreted as confirmations of destiny. The first of those experiences was the failed putsch of November 1923. On the 8th of November of that year, Hitler attempted what he intended to be the beginning of a national revolution, the so-called beer hall putsch, the attempt to take power in Bavaria, to then march on Berlin, following the model of Mussolini's March on Rome of the previous year. The plan failed miserably. The forces of order opened fire on the Nazi marchers in front of the Feldherrnhalle in Munich, killing 16 of them. Hitler was arrested the following day and prosecuted for high treason. The trial was a disaster for the government that sought to condemn Hitler. The process turned into a showcase where Hitler delivered passionate speeches that were widely covered by the national press, converting what should have been his political destruction into a platform for national projection. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the minimum penalty the law allowed for the crime of high treason, and was released after barely 9 months, thanks to the benevolence of the prison director and the sympathy the case had generated in certain sectors of the Bavarian establishment. Hitler interpreted the failed putsch, the prison, and the early release not as what they objectively were, which was a political defeat followed by a lenient sentence, but as a confirmation of destiny. He had survived the defeat. He had turned the trial into a propagandistic triumph. He had emerged from prison as a martyr and not as a criminal. Providence, according to his interpretation, had protected him because he still needed to fulfill his mission. This interpretation was not merely rhetorical. Hitler believed it with a conviction that his closest collaborators described as almost religious. There were other people who believed in Hitler, who followed him, who flattered him, but the first and most fervent believer in Adolf Hitler was Adolf Hitler himself. And this self-belief, this narcissism of almost mythological dimensions, was both his greatest strength as a political leader and the source of his most catastrophic errors as a statesman. Because there is something we need to understand about Hitler's narcissism, and that is that it was not the banal narcissism of the vain man who wants admiration and applause. It was something more complex and much darker. It was the narcissism of the prophet, of the visionary, of the chosen one who feels that his own intuitions, his own impulses, his own inner certainties are by definition superior to any external argument, to any contrary evidence, to any advice from any expert. For someone with this psychological structure, questioning is not simply a disagreement, it is a betrayal, it is a display of incomprehension. It is the demonstration that the questioner does not possess sufficient vision to understand what the chosen one already knows with absolute certainty. This explains one of the most striking patterns of Hitler's political career, his relationship of progressive alienation with everyone who at some point had been his allies, collaborators, or followers, but who later had the audacity to dissent, to doubt, to point out problems in his plans. Röhm, Strasser, Schleicher, and eventually, in the final years of the war, generals like Halder and Zeitzler all ended up being purged from his circle, whether physically or politically, when their insistence on pointing out reality clashed with Hitler's vision. But let us not get too far ahead. Let us return to the 20s and to the process by which Hitler built not only a political party, but a whole mythology of himself. After his release from Landsberg in December 1924, Hitler found himself with a modified political landscape. The Nazi Party had been banned, although not for long. The economic situation of Germany had improved thanks to the American loans of the Dawes Plan and the stabilization of the currency. The climate of desperation and chaos that had nourished the growth of the movement in the early years of the Weimar Republic seemed to be yielding. The German voters, when life became more tolerable, had less interest in the radical solutions that the extremist parties offered. This was one of the most difficult periods in Hitler's career. The party, rebuilt after its ban, grew slowly. The elections of 1928 gave it only 2.6% of the votes, which meant 12 seats in the Reichstag. It was a miserable result. Critics inside and outside the movement spoke of Nazism as a peripheral phenomenon, of an agitator who had reached the limit of his political potential. What did Hitler do during these years of stagnation? Something that would prove crucial to his eventual rise. He built the organizational structure of the party, elaborated the mythology of the movement, and waited. Because Hitler had something that many of his rivals did not have: patience when it was necessary. He could act with fury and urgency, but he could also wait, calculate, prepare for the opportune moment, with a coldness that contrasted with the image of the frenetic agitator he projected at the rallies. The wait ended in October 1929. The crash of the Wall Street stock market triggered the Great Depression, and Germany, whose economic recovery depended almost entirely on American loans that were now being hastily withdrawn, was struck with devastating economic violence. Unemployment in Germany went from approximately 1,300,000 people in 1929 to 6 million in 1932. Businesses, banks, and farms went bankrupt in a cascade. The social assistance system, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of the demand. Millions of families lost their savings, their jobs, their homes. In this context of devastation, Hitler's message, which until then had resonated mainly among resentful war veterans and ultra-nationalist youths, began to penetrate much broader sectors of German society. The middle class, which had saved with effort and saw its savings destroyed twice in a decade, first by the hyperinflation of 1923 and then by the Great Depression. The farmers, who could not pay their debts and saw their properties auctioned. The unemployed youths, who saw no future in the existing political system, all found in Hitler and in the Nazi Party an answer to their anguish. But what kind of answer exactly was that? What did Hitler offer that the other parties did not offer? This is a fundamental question for understanding his psychology and his capacity for attraction. The answer was not primarily in the concrete political program. The 25 points of the Nazi Party were a confusing mix of nationalism, light socialism, anti-Semitism, and economic demagoguery that could hardly be called a coherent program of government. The answer was in something else, in the promise of a narrative that gave meaning to the suffering. Hitler offered explanations. He offered identifiable culprits. He offered the promise that if those culprits were eliminated, if the nation was purified of its corrupting elements, if the German greatness that had been stolen was recovered, then life would once again have meaning, effort would once again bear fruit, the future would once again be possible. It was an illusory promise, built upon historical lies and upon ancestral prejudices. But in a moment of collective economic, political, and psychological collapse, illusion has a power of attraction that complex and ambiguous truth can hardly equal. The elections of September 1930 were the first great earthquake. The Nazi Party went from 12 seats to 107, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. The following 2 years were ones of accelerated growth, more rallies, more propaganda, more violence, more votes. In July 1932, at the highest point of its electoral support, the Nazi Party obtained 37.4% of the votes and 230 seats, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag, although without an absolute majority. And here we arrive at one of the most decisive and most debated moments of modern history, the process by which Hitler, who never obtained an absolute majority in free elections, came to power. On the 30th of January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg signed the decree appointing Adolf Hitler Chancellor of the German Reich. How was it possible? The answer reveals something profoundly disturbing about the nature of political power and about the fatal errors committed by those who believe they can control demagogues. The conservative clique surrounding Hindenburg, led by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, convinced the elderly president that Hitler could be tamed once in government, that the responsibility of the office would moderate him, that the conservative ministers surrounding him would control him, that the reality of governing would force him to abandon his most extreme delusions. Von Papen went so far as to boast, in a phrase that would go down in history as one of the most perfect examples of political arrogance, that in a few months they would have squeezed Hitler until he squeaked. They trusted that the apparatus of the state, the institutions, the bureaucracy, the pressure of international allies would moderate the agitator and turn him into just another conventional politician. They were wrong. They were wrong in such a fundamental way that their error would cost Germany and the world tens of millions of lives. What von Papen and his allies did not understand, what they could not understand because they had never before seen anything like Hitler, was that the new Chancellor was not a conventional politician who could have been moderated by the conventional pressures of the system. He was something fundamentally different, a revolutionary with a total vision of the world, with a mission that he considered providential, and with a will to power that had no institutional, legal, or moral limit that he was not willing to violate when necessary. Hitler's first months in power demonstrated this with a rapidity that should have been terrifying for any observer with open eyes. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire, allegedly by a Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe, although the authorship of the fire continues to be debated by historians. Hitler and Goering used the fire to obtain from President Hindenburg the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and the constitutional protection of German citizens under the pretext of protecting the state from a communist threat. In March 1933, with the Reichstag dominated by a combination of Nazi seats and the imposition of fear on the other parties, the Enabling Act was passed, which basically granted Hitler's government the capacity to legislate without parliament. With this law, the Weimar democracy had legally committed suicide, and Germany had officially entered into dictatorship. The process was extraordinarily fast. In less than 2 years, since Hitler assumed the chancellorship, all political parties except the Nazi Party had been dissolved or had decided to dissolve themselves. The labor unions had been abolished, the free press had been silenced, and a system of political and police control that would reach unprecedented efficiency in history was already under construction. The speed with which this process occurred was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate strategy based on Hitler's understanding that the opportunity presented to him could close if he did not act with speed and decision. But what was Hitler thinking while all this was happening? What was the exact nature of the vision that guided his actions? Was it simply the ambition for power's sake, the desire to dominate, the appetite of the conventional tyrant? Some historians have argued this, reducing Hitler's career to the universal story of the demagogue who promises anything to reach power, and who, once there, is only interested in maintaining it. But this interpretation, while capturing something true, leaves too much unexplained. Because Hitler did not act solely moved by the desire for personal power. He acted moved by an ideology, by a worldview that he had patiently constructed during the Viennese years, and that he maintained with remarkable consistency over the decades. This ideology had fixed, invariable components that he never abandoned regardless of political circumstances: the centrality of anti-Semitism, the necessity to expand the German living space toward the east, the inevitability of a war of extermination against the Soviet Union, and the certainty that the German people had a historical destiny to fulfill under his leadership. The concept of living space, or Lebensraum, is one of the most important for understanding Hitler's vision regarding the destiny of the world and the role he believed he should play. The idea was not original to Hitler. It had been developed by the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel at the end of the 19th century and had circulated widely in German pan-Germanist and militarist circles. But Hitler adopted it and radicalized it. Germany needed to expand its territory to the east, toward the Ukrainian and Russian plains, to obtain the natural resources and the agricultural space that would allow it to become a self-sufficient world power. And the peoples who inhabited that living space in the east, the Slavs, the Russians, the Ukrainians, what would happen to them? In Hitler's vision, they would be subjugated, displaced, or eliminated to make room for the German colonists who would populate that conquered space. This was the core of what historians call the project of Germanization of Eastern Europe, and it was a project of genocide on the most radical scale imaginable. Where did this expansionist and genocidal vision come from? It had multiple roots: the tradition of the medieval Teutonic Knights, who had colonized Eastern Europe by force, the nostalgia for the German colonization of the eastern lands during the Middle Ages, the model of American colonization, to which Hitler explicitly referred in his private conversations, just as the North Americans had conquered the American continent by displacing or exterminating its original inhabitants, and thus creating the geographic basis of a continental power. Germany had to do the same in Eastern Europe. This comparison with the American colonial model is one of the most unsettling revelations of Hitler's thought, because it shows that he was capable of contextualizing his plans within a historical tradition that he not only recognized but admired. He did not see his projects of expansion and destruction as something radically new and aberrant. He saw them as the logical continuation of what great powers had always done when they had sufficient strength to do so. And here we arrive at something that is fundamental to understanding Hitler's psychology in his relationship with power and the destiny of the world: his concept of the will. For Hitler, the will was the most powerful force in the human universe, more powerful than intelligence, more powerful than knowledge, more powerful than material circumstances. A man, a people, a nation that wanted something with sufficient will, with total determination, with an absolute concentration of its energy toward an objective, could overcome any obstacle, conquer any opposition, rewrite any destiny. This almost magical vision of the will as an omnipotent force had its roots partly in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, although Hitler read Nietzsche in such a selective and distorted manner that Nietzsche himself, had he been able to see what was done with his ideas, would have rejected the appropriation with horror. The Nietzschean concept of the will to power was reinterpreted by Hitler in biological and racist terms that Nietzsche never conceived. It was not the will of the exceptional individual who overcomes himself, but the will of the Aryan people to dominate over the inferiors. It was not a philosophy of personal improvement. It was a justification for conquest and subjugation. Hitler's will was also the justification for his own style of leadership, which consisted of decreeing objectives without worrying too much about the actual limitations of the available means to achieve them. For someone who believed that the will could overcome all obstacles, the arguments of technicians, military men, and experts pointing out real limitations always sounded like excuses, like a lack of determination, like the kind of weak and Jewish thinking that had led Germany to defeat in 1918. This pattern manifested itself time and again in Hitler's military career. When German generals pointed out that supply lines were insufficient to sustain a given offensive, Hitler decreed that willpower could compensate for the lack of supplies. When economists warned that the German war economy could not support certain simultaneous campaigns, Hitler insisted that the will of the German people was its greatest resource. When military reality contradicted his plans, Hitler did not adjust the plans to reality. He ordered reality to adjust to the plans. But let us not get too far ahead to the war. Let us return to the 1930s and to the construction of the Nazi state, because there are aspects of that process that are fundamental to understanding how Hitler came to genuinely believe he could control the destiny of the world. One of the most elaborate and most dangerous constructions of the Nazi regime was the cult of personality around Hitler. This cult was not simply the vanity of an autocrat who wanted to be admired. It was a deliberate political project, directed mainly by Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, who understood with exceptional sharpness the psychological mechanisms of mass persuasion in the era of radio and cinema. The Führer, as Hitler began to be called, could not simply be the leader of a political party. He had to be something more, the incarnation of the German national will, the instrument of providence, the historical saviour who arrived in the darkest moment to return to his people the lost greatness. This image was built with a media sophistication that was unprecedented, and that in many ways invented the techniques of political image construction that continue to be used in the 21st century. Leni Riefenstahl's films, especially Triumph of the Will from 1935, made after the Party Congress in Nuremberg in 1934, are the most famous example of this visual construction of the myth. In those images, Hitler is not a politician. He is an almost sacred figure who emerges from the clouds in his airplane, who receives the adoration of millions of followers, organized in perfect geometric formations that evoke both religious liturgy and the architecture of power. The music, the light, the framing, the editing, everything was calculated to produce in the viewer an almost transcendent experience of encounter with something greater than the everyday human. And here is the most disturbing element of this whole process. Hitler was not solely the object of that cult. He was also its first and most devoted consumer. The image of the Führer that Goebbels and Riefenstahl were constructing for the German public was also the image that Hitler himself had of himself. There was no ironic distance between the public and the private figure. The person that millions of Germans saw on posters and in films was the same person that Hitler saw in the mirror. The myth was completely sincere. Historians who have studied Hitler's private world through testimonies of those who knew him closely, from the table talks recorded during the war, from his letters and personal notes, agree on a surprising trait. Hitler was never, in private, different from what he was in public. There was no cynicism of the politician who privately laughs at the beliefs he publicly proclaims. Hitler believed what he said. He believed in the mission. He believed in providence. He believed in his historical role, and this coherence between the public and the private, this authenticity of the fanatic, was in itself one of the elements that made others believe in him. How exactly does the process work by which someone comes to believe that they are destined to control the destiny of the world? To understand it, we need to examine more closely the psychology of political messianism, which is what Hitler's self-perception represented in its most extreme and most dangerous expression. Political messianism, the belief of an individual that they have been chosen to fulfill a historical or transcendental mission, has a long history that includes figures as diverse as Joan of Arc, Napoleon Bonaparte, Oliver Cromwell, and various religious and political leaders from all over the world. What distinguishes genuine messianism from simple political narcissism is the intensity and totality of the conviction, not, I think I can do a good job, but I was chosen, I was prepared, I was sent to fulfill this mission. In Hitler, this messianic conviction was built through several mutually reinforcing mechanisms. The first was retrospective confirmation, the interpretation of his own biography as a sequence of providential tests and preparations. The failures, the difficulties, the war wounds, the failed putsch, the prison. Everything found its place in the narrative of the preparation of the chosen one. There was nothing that could not be incorporated into the story. If something bad happened, it was a test to be overcome. If something good happened, it was a confirmation of destiny. The second mechanism was the experience of political successes, which in the decade of the 1930s were spectacular and confirmed in Hitler's mind that his intuitions were correct and that his instincts were superior to the calculations of the experts. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, which German generals advised against because they estimated France would respond militarily, and Germany was not prepared for that confrontation. Hitler ordered it anyway, and France did not respond. The annexation of Austria in March 1938. It was carried out without firing a shot. The annexation of the Sudetenland in September 1938, obtained through negotiation in Munich, where the representatives of France and Great Britain, desperate to avoid a new war, yielded to Hitler's demands. The occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, again without resistance. Each of these successes, obtained in many cases against the advice of his own generals and diplomats, reinforced in Hitler the conviction that his intuition, his will, his political instinct were superior to any conventional analysis. He had gambled and won repeatedly. Why trust now the pessimists, the prudent ones, those who always found reasons to wait, to negotiate, to moderate? This dynamic is psychologically devastating when it is installed in someone with real power, because the selective confirmation of successes without the balanced correction of failures creates a bubble of cognitive invulnerability that makes learning from errors impossible. Hitler, every time his instincts turned out to be correct, extracted from that success the confirmation that his instincts were always correct. And every time his instincts turned out to be incorrect, the tendency was not to revise the method, but to look for external culprits. The generals who had executed the plan poorly, the allies who had failed, the traitors who had sabotaged the Führer's will. The third mechanism of construction of the messianic conviction was the feedback of his surroundings. Hitler lived surrounded by people who competed among themselves for his favor, and the most effective way to obtain that favor was to confirm his genius, validate his intuitions, celebrate his decisions. Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, Ribbentrop, Speer, each in their own way built their position in Hitler's inner circle by telling him what he wanted to hear. Those who dared to dissent, to point out problems, to defend positions contrary to Hitler's, ended up invariably marginalized, humiliated, or eliminated. The result of this dynamic was the construction of what psychologists call an echo chamber, an informational environment where all voices repeat and amplify the same narrative, where alternative visions cannot penetrate, where reality is filtered through the screen of the myth's confirmation. For someone who already had a pronounced tendency to construct subjective realities, this environment was profoundly destructive because it eliminated the last correction mechanisms that could have moderated the gravest errors of judgment. The fourth and perhaps most disturbing mechanism was the experience of mass adoration. The Nazi Party rallies, especially the annual Nuremberg Congresses, were events of a magnitude and emotional intensity unprecedented in modern political history. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered, organized in perfect geometric formations, illuminated by Speer's searchlights pointing to the sky, resonating with the sound of the chant and applause that arrived in waves when Hitler appeared on the podium. The experience of being at the center of that collective adoration, of being the focus of that massive emotional energy, has documented psychological effects on the individual receiving it. It generates a sensation of grandeur and omnipotence that is almost indistinguishable, in terms of subjective experience, from descriptions of mystical or religious experiences. For someone with Hitler's psychological structure, this experience was not simply satisfying in terms of ego. It was confirming of the messianic narrative that organized his entire vision of the world. Hitler needed those rallies not only politically but psychologically. Various testimonies of those who knew him closely describe the transformation that took place in him before and during the speeches. He would arrive at the podium tense, sometimes anxious, and then, as contact with the audience was established and the energy of the rally enveloped him, he experienced something that can only be described as a transformation. He went from the insecure and tense individual to the orator possessed by something greater than himself. This transformation was visible, physical, almost theatrical in its intensity. And when the rallies ended, when the roar of the applause faded and Hitler returned to his everyday life as Chancellor or Führer, he often experienced a period of depression, an emptiness that only the next rally, the next speech, the next contact with the mass could alleviate. This psychological dependence on the adrenaline of the rallies was one of the most unsettling aspects of Hitler's psychology, because it meant that his optimal emotional state constantly required more, always more. Let us pause here and reflect on something important. We have been describing the psychological mechanisms that built Hitler's conviction that he could and should control the destiny of the world. But there is a question you are perhaps asking yourself. Was Hitler simply crazy? Should his psychology be understood in terms of clinical mental illness? The answer of the majority of historians and psychologists who have studied his case is nuanced and worth explaining. Hitler was not psychotic in the clinical sense. He did not suffer from hallucinations. He was not disconnected from reality in the way that characterizes severe psychoses. He was capable of functioning at a very high level of political and strategic complexity. He could plan, manipulate, calculate, wait for the opportune moment, adapt his tactics to circumstances. However, he had personality traits that in contemporary psychiatric nomenclature would be classified as part of a severe narcissistic personality disorder, combined with significant paranoid traits and an extraordinary capacity for schizotypal thinking, that is, for constructing idiosyncratic belief systems that resisted confrontation with external reality. But more important than any diagnostic label is understanding how these specific psychological characteristics interacted with the specific historical circumstances of Germany in the decades of 1920 and 30 to produce the result that it produced. Hitler's psychology alone does not explain Nazism. What explains Nazism is the confluence of that psychology with a society in profound crisis, with fragile democratic institutions, with a tradition of militarism and authoritarianism, with a structural anti-Semitism centuries old, and with the inability or unwillingness of political elites to confront the threat before it was too late. The historian Ian Kershaw, probably the most complete biographer of Hitler in the English language, formulated it memorably. Hitler was an individual of very ordinary capacities in most aspects of life, including formal education, intellectual sophistication, social empathy, and administrative skills. What made him extraordinary was the combination of his fanatical ideological conviction with an exceptional instinctive political skill and with historical circumstances that turned exactly that combination into something tremendously powerful. Now, let us return to the central question. Why did Hitler believe he could control the destiny of the world? We have already examined the internal psychological mechanisms, the messianic narcissism, the absolutist will, the selective confirmation of successes, the feedback of the adoring environment. But there is something else we need to examine, the specific content of his vision of the world, the concrete ideology that organized his perception of the destiny of the world and his role in it. For Hitler, the world had a simple structure, but of immense consequences. It was an arena of biological struggle between races, understood not as cultural or historical constructions, but as fixed biological realities, genetically determined, hierarchized in terms of value and capacity. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy was the Aryan race, and the German people was its purest and highest expression. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the Jews, who for Hitler were not simply an inferior race, but something qualitatively different, the active agent of the destruction of the superior races, the parasite that weakened peoples from within, the anti-racial force by definition. This vision of the Jews as active agents of destruction was what made Hitler's anti-Semitism something different from the conventional anti-Semitism of his era, however virulent that might be. Traditional anti-Semitism, even in its most violent forms, tended to perceive Jews as a minority that should be segregated, expelled, converted, or in the worst cases, in the worst times, subjected to the violence of pogroms. But Hitler's anti-Semitism was different in nature. He saw Jews not as a troublesome minority, but as an existential threat, as the force that, if not eliminated, would end humanity itself. The scale of the threat that Hitler perceived justified, in his mind, the scale of the response. If the Jews represented an existential threat to humanity, then their elimination was not a crime, but a biological necessity, a measure of racial prophylaxis, the defense of civilization against its destroyer. This logic, monstrous in its formulation and in its consequences, had in Hitler's mind an impeccable internal coherence that derived directly from its racist premises. And when did Hitler arrive at these conclusions? Historiography has intensely debated this question. Some historians, following the intentionalist line, argue that Hitler had from very early on, perhaps from the Viennese years, a clear intention to exterminate European Jews, and that his entire political career was in some sense a preparation for that final objective. Other historians, following the functionalist line, argue that the final solution, the industrialized extermination of European Jews, was not the result of a preconceived plan, but of a progressive radicalization of anti-Jewish policy driven by the dynamic of the regime and the circumstances of the war. The contemporary vision most widely accepted is a synthesis of these two positions and can be summarized like this. Hitler had from long before taking power the general intention to eliminate Jews from German and eventually European life, but the specific methods of that elimination evolved in response to circumstances. The final solution, the systematic physical extermination of European Jews, was a radicalization of that original intention that crystallized in the specific conditions of the Second World War, but whose ideological roots were found in Hitler's writings and speeches of the 1920s. What Hitler saw as his mission regarding the Jews was part of something larger, the construction of a European and eventually global new order based on German and Aryan supremacy. This new order was not simply a political reorganization, it was a total transformation of the structure of human civilization, a refounding based on racial principles that would replace the existing order considered as degenerated, corrupted, and destined for destruction. The scale of this vision, the pretension to refound human civilization, to redraw the racial map of the world, to create a power structure that would last, according to the promise that Hitler repeated with obstinate frequency, 1,000 years, reveals something essential about the nature of his conviction that he could control the destiny of the world. It was not a political ambition in the ordinary sense of the term. It was an eschatological pretension, a vision of the end of history as it had existed and the beginning of a new era, under the architecture that he, Adolf Hitler, had designed. This eschatological pretension has religious resonances that are not accidental. Hitler, although he rejected the Christian religion in private, while publicly keeping up appearances of respect for the church when it was convenient for him, had built a system of beliefs that fulfilled exactly the functions that religion fulfills in human psychology. It explained the origin and nature of the universe through racial biology. It identified good and evil, the superior races and the Jews respectively. It prescribed correct behavior, dedication to the racial struggle. It promised salvation, the eternal greatness of the Germanic Reich, and it pointed out the Saviour, himself. In this sense, Nazism functioned psychologically for its most fervent adepts as a substitute religion, and Hitler was the prophet, the Messiah, and the high priest of that religion simultaneously. And in the psychology of Hitler himself, who had been raised in Catholicism but who rejected it intellectually, This substitute religion fulfilled profound needs that traditional faith could no longer satisfy. There is an aspect of Hitler's psychology that historians have repeatedly pointed out, and that is fundamental to understanding his relationship with destiny, his fascination with death and with the apocalypse. In the private conversations recorded during the war, in his speeches, in the accounts of those who knew him, there repeatedly appears a dimension of thought that psychologists call apocalyptic thinking, the vision that the final confrontation, the decisive battle between the forces of good and evil, that he identified as Aryans and Jews, was not only inevitable but desirable. It was the culminating moment of history toward which everything converged. This fascination with the apocalypse had a terrible practical and political implication. Hitler was not a leader who valued the survival of his people above all else. He was a leader who, in the appropriate circumstances, could prioritize the greatness of the combat and the purity of the sacrifice over the preservation of human lives. And those appropriate circumstances would occur precisely when it became evident that the war was lost. But again, we are anticipating the end of the story. Let us go back to the year 1933 and to the process of building the Nazi state, because there are aspects of that process that reveal important dimensions of Hitler's psychology that we have not yet explored. One of the most striking aspects of Hitler's functioning as a ruler is the fundamental tension between his public image as an all-powerful and omniscient leader and the reality of his governing method, which was chaotic, improvised, and frequently indecisive on concrete details. Hitler hated bureaucracy, hated administrative procedures, hated everyday decisions that involved technical details that he found boring. He arrived late to meetings, or did not arrive at all. He postponed difficult decisions for weeks. He let his subordinates compete among themselves for his favour, which generated a system of government that was extraordinarily inefficient and plagued with duplications and jurisdictional conflicts. How is this reality reconciled with the image of the all-powerful Führer? The answer is that Hitler's power was not exercised through everyday administrative control of the state apparatus, which he left in the hands of different subordinates in permanent competition. It was exercised through something much more fundamental, the monopoly of the general strategic direction, of the definition of the ultimate objectives, of the decisions of principle that established the framework within which everyone else had to operate. Hitler made the big decisions, whether to go to war or not, to attack in this direction or that, to exterminate the Jews or expel them, to ally with Stalin or invade him. What he did not do was occupy himself with the concrete means of implementing those decisions, which he left to a system of subordinates who frequently obstructed each other in their competition for resources and the attention of the Führer. This system, which the historian Martin Brosat described as polycracy, was in many ways the reflection of its creator's psychology. The centre held the vision and the direction. The periphery dealt with the details in which the centre had no interest or patience. Hitler's indifference to administrative details contrasted with his obsessive attention to appearance, propaganda, public image, and grand architectural projects. The gigantic remodeling program for Berlin and other German cities, conceived alongside his favourite architect Albert Speer, and destined to transform the capital of the Reich into the monumental Germania that Hitler imagined as the capital of the world, consumed hours and hours of the attention of a Führer who frequently did not have time to read military reports. Buildings, monuments, the grandiose scenography of power, these were the things that genuinely fascinated Hitler, which recalled the frustrated artist whose original identity had been sublimated but not eliminated in the political project. There is a phrase of Hitler's, recorded by Albert Speer in his memoirs, that illuminates this aspect of his psychology in an extraordinary way. Contemplating the architectural models of the future Germania, Hitler once said, "Do you know why I have to make all this so big? So that coming centuries will not be able to forget it." Monumental greatness was not an aesthetic caprice. It was a response to the fundamental fear of being forgotten. of not leaving a sufficiently deep mark on history to guarantee immortality. Architecture was the materialization of his aspiration to eternity. And this leads us to one of the most profoundly revealing aspects of Hitler's psychology, his relationship with posterity, with the judgment of history, with the legacy he would leave after his death. Hitler thought constantly about how he would be judged by future generations. He imagined himself already canonized by history, seen by coming centuries as the founder of the greatest empire the world had ever known, the man who had created a new civilization. And this vision of his future legacy was one of the most powerful drivers of his present decisions. This orientation toward posterity explains why Hitler frequently made decisions that were rationally unreasonable from the perspective of the immediate interests of the Reich, but that made sense within the logic of his total historical project. Continuing the extermination of the Jews, when transport and personnel resources were desperately needed for the war effort, insisting on lost battles when the cost in lives was devastating, rejecting peace negotiations when it was still possible to obtain acceptable conditions. All of this made sense within the logic of someone who was playing a historical game of millennia, not a political game of decades. For Hitler, compromising, negotiating, retreating, all of that amounted to betraying his destiny, to demonstrating that he was not the chosen one he believed he was, to becoming just another politician among the many who had passed through history without leaving an indelible mark. He preferred total catastrophe over partial victory that required compromises. He preferred glorious defeat over mediocre survival. This preference for all or nothing, for total success or total failure, is one of the most consistent traits of Hitler's psychology, from his early years in politics until the end in the Berlin bunker. It is the reflection of a psychological structure that clinicians associate with dichotomous thinking, the inability to tolerate greys, to accept that reality exists on a spectrum of possible outcomes that include many points between absolute triumph and total catastrophe. And in a figure with power over the life and death of tens of millions of people, this type of dichotomous thinking was not simply a curious personal characteristic. It was a destructive force of the first magnitude, capable of turning the stakes of any political or military confrontation into something existential, into something where there was no possibility of an honourable retreat, where the only alternative to total victory was total destruction. Let us return now to something we have mentioned several times, but which deserves a deeper analysis: Hitler's relationship with Providence. This relationship was not simply rhetorical, it was one of the most genuine and most fundamental elements of his psychology, and its evolution throughout his life is a map of how his self-perception as the chosen one of destiny became radicalized with the passage of time. In his early public speeches, Hitler already referred to Providence as a force that guided his steps, but in a manner relatively conventional for the political religious rhetoric of the era. It was common for political leaders of the 20th century to invoke God or Providence as backing for their national projects. What was different in Hitler was the progressive personalization of that relationship. Not God guides Germany, but Providence chose me to guide Germany. This personalization intensified after each overcome crisis, after each unexpected success, after each miraculous escape from danger. The assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, in which the bomb that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed under the conference table at Hitler's general headquarters in East Prussia, killed 4 people but left Hitler with relatively minor injuries, was interpreted by him as the most conclusive proof of providential protection. He emerged from the room where the bomb had exploded with his trousers torn and his hair singed, and his first reaction was, "Providence protected me. I still have work to do." This conviction of providential protection, far from moderating in the face of evidence that the war was being lost, intensified in the final years of the conflict. As the German armies retreated on all fronts, as German cities were reduced to rubble by Allied bombings, as reports on human losses reached apocalyptic figures, Hitler took refuge increasingly in the certainty that Providence could not have brought him so far to let him fail at the end. Some change in circumstances, some historical miracle, some rupture in the enemy alliance had to occur inevitably to invert the situation. This wait for the miracle, documented in numerous conversations in the final months of the war, was not simply political desperation. It was the coherent result of an entire life of providential thinking. If Providence had protected him, chosen him, guided him, and confirmed him in every stage of his career, then destiny could not end in defeat. Defeat was unthinkable not because the military data did not signal it clearly, but because it contradicted the fundamental narrative upon which Hitler's entire identity rested. What does someone do whose entire identity rests upon a narrative that reality is contradicting with increasing brutality? The psychological options are basically three: revise the narrative, dissociate from reality, or find an explanation that preserves the narrative without the need to revise it. Hitler chose the last two. Every military failure was the fault of traitorous or incompetent generals. Every defeat was the result of sabotage by antisocial elements within Germany. Providence continued acting. The problem was that the human instruments through which it acted failed in their mission. And at some point in the final months of the war, a fourth option began to be added. If the German people were incapable of winning the war that their Führer had conceived and directed, then the German people had proven themselves unworthy of their historical destiny, and their destruction was the result they deserved. This terrible logic, which turned the victims of the war into those guilty of their own victimization, is perhaps the most extreme and most revealing manifestation of all of Hitler's psychology. Until the end, the problem was never him. It was never his vision. It was never his decisions. The problem was always the world, which was not up to his expectations. But before reaching the end, we need to return to the beginning of the war, to the years between 1933 and 1939, when Hitler's vision for the destiny of the world began to materialize in concrete and visible ways that convinced millions of Germans that their Führer was, effectively, the instrument of something greater than the ordinary. We must understand how Germans experienced the rise of the Reich. In Hitler's first years in power, the experience of many Germans was surprisingly positive, at least in terms of simple economic indicators. Unemployment, which had been 6 million when Hitler assumed the chancellorship in 1933, had dropped dramatically by 1936, when Germany had practically reached full employment. Public works, rearmament, construction projects, and the mobilization of the war economy had absorbed the unemployed and had created the appearance of prosperity. We say appearance because the German economic recovery of the 1930s was fundamentally artificial, based on massive deficit spending, financed by a debt that the German economy could never have paid under normal conditions. The Third Reich was, in economic terms, a sustainable project only to the extent that the conquest of new territories would provide the necessary resources to feed it. The war was not simply the instrument of the racial expansion that Hitler dreamed of. It was also the economic condition for the survival of the regime. But the ordinary Germans of the mid-1930s did not see that. They saw that they had work, that order had been restored after the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic, that Germany was once again a respected power on the international stage, that the dishonor of the Treaty of Versailles was being reversed inch by inch. They saw the Olympics of 1936 in Berlin, which was a masterful propagandistic production that presented to the world a modern, orderly, and vibrant Germany. They saw the Olympic Games, with which Germany won more medals than any other country, which was interpreted as a confirmation of the Aryan superiority that Hitler preached. And above all, they saw their Führer, who did not seem like a conventional politician, but something different. A figure who combined the authority of a military leader, the fervor of a prophet, and the astuteness of a statesman with diplomatic successes that seemed to confirm his genius. Foreign analysts who visited Germany at that time and wrote reports about the Reich described with a mixture of fascination and unease the cult of personality surrounding Hitler and the genuine devotion that many ordinary Germans professed to him. It was not just propaganda, although the propaganda was ubiquitous and sophisticated. It was also the genuine experience of people who had suffered the shame and desperation of the Weimar years, and who now saw their nation recovering its pride and power. The price of that recovery, paid by German Jews, who were systematically stripped of their civil rights from the very moment Hitler took power, was visible but preferred not to be seen. When it is necessary to choose between one's own prosperity and justice for others, collective psychology has a remarkable capacity to not see what it prefers not to see. The Nuremberg laws of September 1935, which deprived German Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, were received by the majority of non-Jewish Germans with indifference or even with approval. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the 9th of November 1938, when groups of the SA and the SS organized pogroms throughout Germany, destroying synagogues and Jewish businesses, murdering dozens of people and sending thousands to concentration camps, produced more discomfort among the population, not mainly because of the injustice, but because of the disorder and the visible destruction. The image of efficiency and order of the Reich that Germans wanted to have of their nation contradicted the broken glass and the smoke from the burned buildings. Goebbels recorded in his diary Hitler's reaction to the pogroms, not disapproval, but irritation over the bad image they generated. The persecution had to continue, but in a more orderly, more efficient way, less visible to the internal and international public. This preference of Hitler's for cleanliness and order in the implementation of his darkest objectives was not hypocrisy. It was the manifestation of a psychology that separated the vision from the means, that could hold ideals of greatness and purity, while simultaneously ordering murder. What did world leaders think of Hitler during these years? The answer is unsettling. Many of them underestimated him in ways that are almost incomprehensible in hindsight. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, after his meeting with Hitler in Berchtesgaden in September 1938, wrote to his sister that he had found a man who could be relied upon when he gave his word. Winston Churchill, who was a minority and frequently ignored voice in the British political establishment of the era, warned long before that Hitler was an existential threat who could only be neutralized by force. But for too long, too many people in positions of power chose to believe that Hitler was negotiable, that he had limited objectives that could be satisfied with reasonable concessions, that the responsibility of office and the realities of international politics would moderate him. This systematic underestimation has multiple causes. One of them was the inability of many observers to believe that a modern head of state could be genuinely driven by an ideology so extreme in its objectives. The leaders of the 20th century, in the experience of Western diplomats and statesmen, were pragmatists who adjusted their objectives to circumstances, who used radical language as a rhetorical tool, while pursuing conventional goals of power and influence. They projected onto Hitler their own political psychology, and what they found was an unrecognizable image. Another cause was the fear of another war after the devastation of the First World War. The memory of the trenches, of the millions of dead in battles that seemed to serve for nothing, dominated the collective psychology of the political and military elites of France and Great Britain. The policy of appeasement, as Chamberlain's strategy of making concessions to Hitler to avoid conflict was called, was not simply cowardice or naivety. It was the result of a genuine, albeit flawed, calculation about which was the lesser of the available evils. Hitler understood this fear and exploited it with a political skill that is, in retrospect, frankly astonishing. In the diplomatic negotiations of the 1930s, he combined the threat of war with the offer of peace in a way that paralyzed his interlocutors. He presented each demand as the last, as the one that, if satisfied, would guarantee perpetual stability. And when a concession was obtained, the next demand followed immediately. This tactic of escalating demands, known in negotiation theory as salami tactics, for the image of cutting slices one by one, was perfectly adapted to the psychology of the Western leaders, whom Hitler had analysed with precision. He knew they were willing to yield a lot to avoid war. He knew that the limit of their tolerance was higher than what they themselves believed, and he knew that every concession obtained without consequences confirmed him in his conviction that his instinct was superior to that of his adversaries. In this sense, the policy of appeasement was one of the most important factors in the construction of Hitler's conviction that he could control the destiny of the world. Every time they yielded to his demands, every time they treated him as a reasonable statesman with limited objectives, instead of as the existential threat he was, they reinforced in his mind the image that it was he who dominated the European chessboard, that the others were pawns and he the master. And this image, projected from the outside onto an internal psychological structure that already tended toward narcissism and messianism, produced a feedback loop that pushed the conviction to the limit of the possible. The turning point came on the 1st of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. France and Great Britain, which had guaranteed the independence of Poland, declared war on Germany. Hitler, according to several accounts, did not expect this reaction or expected it to be purely symbolic. When he was informed that the British had declared war, there was a moment of bewilderment, almost panic, that contrasted with the image of calculated imperturbability he habitually projected. That moment of bewilderment was ephemeral. Hitler's psychology, his certainty of being on the right side of destiny, quickly imposed itself. The war with France and Great Britain was, within his worldview, eventually inevitable. It had simply arrived earlier than he had planned, and what occurred in the next 9 months seemingly confirmed his certainties in a way that would prove catastrophic for the rest of the world. The fall of France in 6 weeks, between May and June of 1940, was probably Hitler's greatest military triumph and the one that had the most consequences for his psychology. France was the premier continental military power in Europe, the nation that had fought the last 4 years of the Great War and that had contained German expansionist ambitions for decades. Its defeat in 6 weeks in the face of the New Lightning War, the Blitzkrieg, was so fast and so complete that it stunned the entire world, including the Germans themselves. The generals who had advised caution, who had pointed out the risks of the operation, who had proposed more prudent modifications to the plan, were left looking ridiculous in the face of the speed and magnitude of the triumph. And Hitler knew it, and he enjoyed it, and he interpreted it as the most resounding confirmation up to that point that his instincts were superior to the calculations of his experts, that the will he embodied could overcome all the obstacles that prudence pointed out, that indeed Providence was guiding him toward a destiny that the mediocre and the prudent could never see. This is the peak of Hitler's psychology as a believer in his capacity to control the destiny of the world. The summer of 1940 was the moment when that conviction reached its maximum intensity, when the distance between the vision of himself and external reality was the narrowest of his entire life. Germany dominated the European continent in a way that had no modern precedent. The British Empire remained the only active enemy, but was on the defensive. The Soviet Union was still an ally of convenience. The United States had not entered the conflict. The project of refounding the world order seemed, from the perspective of that summer of 1940, genuinely within reach. It was precisely at that moment of maximum triumph when Hitler made the decision that would be the beginning of his destruction, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Why invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when Great Britain remained undefeated, when the USA was showing increasing signs of active support for the Allies, when the most prudent strategy would have been to consolidate the existing conquests before opening a new front? The answer is that for Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not one strategic option among others, but the fundamental raison d'etre of his entire political project. It was the ideological core of Nazism, the conquest of living space in the East, the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism, the liquidation of what Hitler called the criminal state of the Soviets, and the colonization of its territories by the German people. In this sense, invading the Soviet Union was for Hitler more important than defeating Great Britain. Great Britain was a circumstantial adversary. Russia was the existential enemy. And the certainty that the Red Army, weakened by Stalin's purges, which had eliminated a large part of its officer corps, would collapse before German military might in a few weeks, was so profound in Hitler that he did not even seriously consider the arguments of the few who pointed out the enormous risks of the enterprise. Operation Barbarossa began on the 22nd of June, 1941, with 153 German and Allied divisions, the largest invasion army in human history up to that moment, attacking along a front of approximately 3,000 kilometers. The first months confirmed the most optimistic expectations. Enormous advances on all fronts, Soviet cities falling one after another, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers captured in massive encirclement operations. The collapse of the Soviet state seemed imminent, and then reality began to alter in ways that Hitler's certainty could not anticipate or accept. The Soviet winter arrived earlier and with more violence than foreseen. The German army, equipped for a summer campaign that was supposed to have ended before autumn, had no adequate clothing for temperatures of -30 degrees. Logistics, which generals had warned would be insufficient to sustain the advance into the depths of Soviet territory, began to crack under the weight of the demands. And the Red Army, which according to Hitler could not resist, kept fighting. In December 1941, German armies were in sight of Moscow but could not take it. And at that moment, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans dozens of kilometers to the west, in climatic conditions that made organized resistance almost impossible. It was Hitler who ordered the troops to maintain their positions, not to retreat, to fight for every square meter of ground, even though the generals argued that tactical movement was necessary to preserve the army. In this specific case, his certainty turned out to be partially correct. The line was held, and the German army did not suffer the total catastrophe that some pessimistic projections contemplated. This relative success in the hold the positions of December 1941 reinforced in Hitler the conviction that his judgment was superior to that of his generals in military tactics as well, which would have even graver consequences in the decisions that would come. But what is important for our analysis of Hitler's psychology is not so much the specific result of each battle or campaign, but the general pattern, the inability to integrate information that contradicted his vision, the externalization of failures onto others, the intensification of certainty in the face of adversity, instead of the revision of premises. These patterns, which we have identified throughout his entire life, since the Viennese years, manifested themselves in the conduct of the war with a clarity that would be tragically costly. And while the war unfolded in the East, with a violence that surpassed in brutality everything that modern conflicts had produced until then, in the occupied territories, the process that Hitler had preached as his providential mission from the beginning of his career was taking place: the extermination of the European Jews. The history of the Holocaust is known in its broad outlines by anyone with a basic education about the 20th century. 6 million European Jews murdered, in addition to millions of people from other categories that the Nazi regime identified as undesirables: gypsies, people with disabilities, homosexuals, communists, Soviet prisoners of war. The extermination camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, names that have become synonymous with all the cruelty humanity can achieve when it is organized industrially and put at the service of a totalitarian ideology. What we want to examine here is not the history of the Holocaust itself, but what the Holocaust reveals about the psychology of Hitler and about the nature of his conviction that he could and should control the destiny of the world. First, the Holocaust was the systematic implementation of the part of Hitler's ideology that had always been the most central, the most inalienable, the one that had never been a tactical instrument but an objective in itself. In all the history of Nazism, there is a perfectly traceable line of continuity from the first anti-Semitic writings of Hitler in his Viennese years to the extermination orders of the Second World War. It is not a history of unforeseen radicalization. It is the history of an idea that waited for the opportunity of its realization. Second, the fact that Hitler insisted on continuing the extermination, even when it began to be militarily counterproductive, when the transport resources destined to take Jews to the camps were desperately needed for the front, when Germany's international image suffered from the news filtering out about what was happening in the camps, reveals that for him, the extermination was not an instrument in the service of military victory. It was an objective in itself, with its own logic, its own urgency, its own calendar independent of strategic circumstances. Third, the Holocaust reveals the absolute scale of Hitler's vision regarding the destiny of the world. It was not just territorial conquest that he sought. It was the racial transformation of the world, the biological redefinition of who would be the human beings of the future. This pretension of biological engineering of humanity is perhaps the most extreme manifestation of the conviction that he could control the destiny of the world, not just the destiny of states and nations, but the destiny of the human species itself. What kind of mind conceives a project of that scale and tries to carry it out? This is the question that most defies comprehension, the one that most forces us to confront something profoundly disturbing about the capacities of human psychology. The answer cannot be found solely in the individual pathology of Hitler, although that pathology is real and documentable. It has to be found also in the social, cultural, and historical structure that made it possible for that individual pathology to become state policy, that found instruments willing to execute it, that generated enough support or enough passivity to sustain itself for years. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, coined the phrase the banality of evil to describe what she discovered in that man who had been one of the principal logistical organizers of the Holocaust. Not a monster, not a demonic figure, but a mediocre bureaucrat who simply executed orders, who had disconnected his moral capacity from his professional acts, who had reduced extermination to an administrative problem of transport and organization. The phrase has been debated and nuanced by historians, but its core remains valid. The Holocaust required not only the fanaticisms of Hitler, but also the participation or complicity of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. What this means for our understanding of Hitler's psychology is that his capacity to control the destiny of the world, to the extent that he really controlled it during a devastating period, depended not only on his individual characteristics, but on his capacity to activate and channel something that was already present in the society surrounding him: fear, resentment, prejudice, the willingness to obey authority, the capacity to disconnect empathy when the victims are sufficiently others. And here we arrive at perhaps the most unsettling dimension of this whole story, the question of whether the conditions that made Hitler possible are unique and unrepeatable, or if they exist in potential in any society under sufficiently extreme circumstances. The historians and social psychologists who have studied this question are unanimous in pointing out that the answer cannot be comforting. The conditions that produced Nazism, which were not exclusively German, included a devastating economic crisis that destroyed the material security of millions of people, creating the psychological conditions for the search for radical solutions and scapegoats. Young and fragile democratic institutions without the historical legitimacy necessary to resist the onslaughts of anti-democratic movements. A complacent political elite that underestimated the threat and believed it could domesticate the demagogue. And a cultural tradition that combined authoritarianism, militarism, and anti-Semitism in ways that were specifically German, but not exclusively German. None of these conditions is impossible in principle. Economic crisis can occur. Fragile democracies exist. Demagogues with exceptional political skills and extreme psychologies also exist. The difference lies in the capacity of societies to recognize the threat before it is too late, to strengthen democratic institutions, to resist the appeal of simple explanations and identifiable culprits in moments of collective anguish. But let us not get too far from the territory of Hitler's individual psychology, because there are aspects of that psychology that we have not yet examined and that are fundamental to understanding the complete arc of his life and his conviction about the destiny of the world. One of those aspects is loneliness. Hitler was, in a fundamental sense, and despite always being the center of a multitude of followers, flatterers, and officials, a profoundly lonely being. He had no friends in the full sense of the word, relationships of equality, of reciprocity, of mutual trust. He had collaborators, he had followers, he had flatterers, he had subordinates, but he had no peers. The only relationship that approached friendship in his life was perhaps that from his youth years with August Kubizek, a young musician with whom he shared a room in Vienna for a time, and who left memoirs that are one of the most valuable sources for the psychology of the young Hitler. And that relationship ended when Hitler, who already then needed to be the center of all attention and tolerated neither being equaled nor contradicted, distanced himself from Kubizek without any apparent dispute mediating. Hitler's relationships with women are also revealing of his psychology. He had several documented relationships throughout his life, the most important and lasting of which was with Eva Braun, a young photographer who became his companion from the early 30s until the death of both in the Berlin bunker in April 1945. Eva Braun was, by all accounts, a woman totally dedicated to Hitler, but without any role in his political or public life, limiting herself to being a private presence confined to his personal residences, especially to Berchtesgaden, the Alpine residence where Hitler spent long periods. The exact nature of the relationship between Hitler and Eva Braun has been debated by historians, including the question of whether it was fully sexual. What is clear is that Hitler did not consider her an equal either in the intellectual sense, the political sense, or the personal sense. She was a companion of comfort, a domestic presence, a form of normality that coexisted completely separate from the public and political dimension of his life. There are other women in Hitler's life whose stories are darker and more revealing of his psychological patterns. Angela Raubal, known as Gailey, was Hitler's niece, daughter of his half-sister Angela, and lived in his Munich apartment from 1925 until 1931. The relationship between Hitler and his niece was, according to all indications, obsessive on his part. He controlled her, prevented her from having an independent social life, followed and watched her, and reacted with fury to any indication that she might be interested in other men. On the 18th of September 1931, Gailey Raubal was found dead in Hitler's apartment in Munich with a gunshot to the heart. The official investigation concluded that it had been suicide. This conclusion is the most probable according to historians, although the exact nature of the events leading to her death continues to be debated. What is beyond all doubt is that Hitler was devastated by her death in a way he did not experience again for any other person, and that Gailey's death became one of the few wounds that seemed to penetrate the armor of his psychology. What does this story say about Hitler's psychology? The need for total control over the people upon whom he feels emotionally dependent, the inability to tolerate the autonomy of the one he loves, the confusion between love and possession. These are the traits that emerge from the pattern of his most intimate relationships, and they are the same traits that we find amplified on a historical scale in his relationship with Germany and with the world. Also, Germany was for Hitler something he had to possess totally, control totally, and which, if it failed in its mission, had to be destroyed. Hitler's relationship with death, both the death of others and his own, is another crucial element of his psychology that we need to examine. We have already mentioned his fascination with the apocalypse, with the final battle, with the purifying sacrifice. This fascination had roots both personal and ideological. On the personal level, there was the never completely processed grief over the death of his mother, which had been the first great experience of loss in his life and which was repeated in other subsequent losses, including that of Gailey. On the ideological level, there was the social Darwinist worldview that saw violence and death as the basic mechanisms of historical progress, as the purifying force that eliminated the weak and allowed the strong to advance. Hitler spoke many times of his own death. He feared growing old, he feared disease, he feared losing his faculties before completing his mission. At various moments in his political life, especially in the 1930s, he expressed the feeling that time was slipping away from him, that he must act before his health deteriorated. This urgency, this sensation that the biological clock was marking the rhythm of his historical project, contributed to the acceleration of his plans and to the impatience with which he rejected any proposal that implied waiting. In the final months of the war, however, Hitler's attitude toward his own death underwent a notable change. As defeat became evident, death ceased to be the obstacle that had to be avoided to fulfill the mission and became the appropriate denouement of the heroic narrative he had constructed about himself. Like Wagner, whose operas he loved with the intensity of one who finds in art the only adequate expression of his deepest emotions, Hitler saw in the catastrophic end the natural and correct conclusion of the tragedy he had starred in, the Gotterdammerung, the twilight of the gods, the end in flames that was at the same time destruction and sublimation. On the 30th of April 1945, while Soviet troops fought less than a kilometre from the bunker located under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life with a gunshot to the temple. Eva Braun, who had remained beside him in the bunker during the final weeks, and who had married him in a civil ceremony the night before, took a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were cremated in the Chancellery garden, amidst the Soviet bombardments that were reducing Berlin to rubble. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. But those 12 years had cost the world between 60 and 80 million human lives, had devastated an entire continent, had produced the most systematic and most documented crime in human history, and had left a wound in the conscience of civilization that remains incompletely closed almost 80 years later. Had Hitler controlled the destiny of the world? In the most literal sense of the question, yes, he had changed the world irreversibly, but not toward the direction he had proclaimed as his mission, not toward the 1,000-year Reich of Aryan supremacy, toward exactly the opposite, the creation of a world where ideologies of racial superiority were formally rejected in international treaties, where the Jewish people had for the first time in 2 millennia a state of their own in the ancestral land of Israel, where democratic powers had learned the lesson that appeasement before demagogues carries an unbearable cost. The history of Hitler is the history of a failure that changed the world, the history of a mind that believed it could control it, and that instead was controlled by its own internal constructions, until these crashed against reality in the most spectacular and costliest collision of modern history. What lessons can we extract? This is the question that deserves a serious answer, not as an academic exercise, but as a reflection on how historical knowledge can serve to comprehend the present. The first lesson is about the dangerousness of narratives of superiority, ideologies that claim that a specific human group is superior to others, and has for that reason the right or the obligation to dominate or eliminate them, are not simply intellectual errors. They are cognitive structures that, once sincerely adopted, can logically lead to consequences that to any outside observer result monstrous. Hitler's anti-Semitism did not go from zero to genocide in one leap. It was a gradual radicalization, consistent with his own internal logic, that advanced step by step from prejudice to extermination. The second lesson is about the fragility of democratic institutions. The Weimar Republic was not destroyed solely by Hitler. It was destroyed by the combination of a devastating economic crisis, of democratic institutions that had not taken sufficiently deep root in the German political culture, of a political elite that preferred the short-term calculation of using Hitler for their own ends over the firm defense of democratic principles, and of a population that in conditions of desperation chose the promise of greatness over the preservation of liberty. Democracies are not automatically robust. They require active cultivation, energetic defense, and citizens committed to their principles. The third lesson is about the importance of not underestimating the threat of demagogues. Every time that someone in the contemporary world, in any country, combines exclusivist nationalism with anti-Semitism, or with hatred toward any minority, with the cult of personality, with contempt for democratic institutions and controls, with the promise of a lost national greatness that only a providential leader can restore. Those are the warning signs that the history of the 20th century has taught us to recognize. They are not infallible signs that catastrophe is inevitable, but they are signals that the danger is real and that the response must be firm and early. The fourth lesson is about individual responsibility in authoritarian systems. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Holocaust is not the monstrosity of Hitler, which is relatively easy to categorize as exceptional and to distance psychologically. It is the participation of ordinary people, the officials who signed the papers, the police who executed the orders, the railway workers who drove the trains, the neighbors who looked the other way. The Holocaust required the cooperation, or the passivity, of tens of thousands of people who in their private lives were not monsters. What led them to participate or to look the other way? This question does not have a single answer, but it has answers that include peer pressure, obedience to authority, fear of the consequences of resistance, and the gradual normalization of what initially seemed unthinkable. The fifth lesson is about the price of silence. The Germans who saw the persecution of their Jewish neighbors since 1933 and did nothing. The world leaders who knew of the deportations and the camps and delayed acting or chose not to act. The religious and international organizations that kept silence so as not to complicate their relations with the Nazi regime, all contributed, in different measures and in different ways, to making the horror possible. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. This lesson has direct application in the contemporary world, where genocide and crimes against humanity continue to occur and continue to generate debates over whether the cost of intervening is too high. The sixth and final lesson that I want to point out here is perhaps the most difficult to articulate, but also the most important. The lesson about the humanity of evil. Hitler was not a being from another planet. He was not a demon in the literal sense. He was not something completely alien to the human species. He was the product of the same forces that produce all human beings: family, culture, history, personal experiences, the historical moment. To say this is not to excuse him, it is to recognize something that is much more disturbing than incomprehensible monstrosity. That the conditions that produced Hitler are conditions that can, in principle, be reproduced in any society that does not pay attention to the warning signs. This is the reason why the study of Hitler's psychology, as disturbing as it may be, as uncomfortable as it may result, is fundamentally necessary. Not to admire him, not to understand him in a compassionate way, not to find extenuating circumstances where there are none, but rather to recognize the mechanisms, identify the patterns, understand the process, and in that understanding, perhaps, find some of the necessary tools to prevent it from repeating. Because history does not repeat itself exactly. Circumstances are never identical, but the psychological and social mechanisms that produce authoritarianism, fanaticism, genocide, these do tend to repeat themselves with a consistency that history demonstrates over and over again. And the knowledge of those mechanisms is, if used correctly, one of the most important forms of resistance that free citizens have at their disposal.